Welcome. I'm Jim Falk. Today we're going to be talking about the United States-North Korea relationship, contentious as it is. That North Korea is only one of three countries that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons is, of course, great concern. This past April, President Biden hosted South Korea's president for a summit marking the 70th anniversary of our alliance. Critical points were addressed, including the strength of the U.S. commitment to defend South Korea from an attack from its northern neighbor. So what is our present relationship with a country that is often described as the Hermit Kingdom? Let's hear what our experts have to say. Coming to us from Washington, D.C. is Jenny Town. She's a senior fellow and director of the Stimson Center's 38 North program, which provides in-depth analysis on North Korea. Dr. Siegfried Hecker is a leading expert on nuclear issues, and from 1986 to 1997, he was the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory located in New Mexico, and he is the author of Hinge Points, an inside look at North Korea's nuclear program. Let's hear what they have to say. Great to see both of you, and thank you for joining us on the program. Ms. Town, I'd like to start with you because there really has been an escalation over the last several years and especially over the last few months of rhetoric and missile tests from North Korea. How many have there been already in 2023, and how is that an increase, say, from 2022 and prior years?
Well, in 2023, we've seen several new missiles and especially new technologies, especially in solid fuel ICBMs, and that was really the big one. This isn't as many as what we saw last year. For instance, last year we saw more than 60 ballistic missile launches, as well as over 90 missile launches in total, in a mixture of new technologies as well as what the North Koreans are now calling missile deployment drills or missile operational drills. And so it really is a different time than what we saw prior to 2018, for instance, where North Korea used to do, maybe 1 to 2 to do missiles per month, right? Like back in 2017, we thought it was an unrelenting pace of missile testing, and looking back on it now in 2017, it was only 23 missile tests. So it really has gone up a lot.
Dr. Hecker, you have one of the few people who visited North Korea in the early period from, say, 2004 on. And so you have a unique perspective about North Korea's nuclear strategy going back some 20 years. Why did they pursue this avenue, and was the diplomatic approach closed off to them?
No, actually, I think they were pursuing a combination of the diplomatic approach and building nuclear weapons. And actually, that's the point that I try to emphasize in my book, as you mentioned, my book called Hinge Points. And that is now going back more than 30 years, sort of at the end of the Cold War, Kim Il-sung, at that time, the leader called the great leader of North Korea, made the decision that he would try to reach accommodation with the U.S., normalization with the United States through diplomacy. However, as you look at the history of North Korea going back to the Korean War, and then particularly as you look at the rise of South Korea and sort of the demise of North Korean capabilities, they felt themselves weak enough that they felt they also had to develop the nuclear weapon option. And so I try to develop this story that what they were doing was pursuing a dual track strategy. That is, pursuing normalization with the U.S. on one hand, but just in case that doesn't work out. And because the conventional military was quite weaker than South Korea's, particularly South Korea and U.S. combined, they would pursue nuclear weapons. And so the story that Jenny just told of their nuclear missile testing, we've been watching that now for the last 30 years.
One of the things that puzzles me, Dr. Hecker, is that we think of North Korea, and I mentioned earlier, as a hermit kingdom, isolated, famine, poor folks. How were they able to get the scientists and the wherewithal to develop such a program?
Well, first of all, the they certainly had help from particularly the Soviet Union in the spirit of what actually President Eisenhower started in 1953, and that is Atoms for Peace. And so after the Second World War, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the demonstration of nuclear weapons with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was quite clear at that point that nuclear is a different technology. And President Eisenhower tried to swing the world from pursuing nuclear weapons to pursuing atoms for peace. And the reason I mention that is because that's how then we took the countries that were friendly towards us to try to help them develop civilian nuclear technology. So, for example, we built the first research reactor of all places in Tehran, in Iran. Well, similarly, the Soviet Union did sort of the Soviet Atoms for Peace, and they then helped to educate the North Koreans in nuclear technologies. They built the first research reactor. So that was the beginning. It was through help and assistance for peaceful uses of atomic energy.
Jenny, were they members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
They are the only country that was once part of the NPT that then withdrew and built a nuclear weapons program. And that's part of the reason why this is such a contentious issue, because the non-proliferation implications of North Korea being successful in doing this really does have a much broader impact to other countries. And we're starting to see this with Iran, for instance, and we're definitely starting to see this even with South Korea as to considering their options. What does it mean to withdraw from the NPT? What would be considered a crisis enough situation to justify that move and to follow suit? And how is the rest of the world going to react to that? Will they be treated the same way North Korea is? Or is there some other gradation of acceptance and or rejection of this notion? I think we're all kind of still struggling to deal with that right now.
And I want to take us now to 2023, and in a sense, this is a segue to what you said, because nuclear weapons are, in a sense, ideally designed to be a deterrence. And so are conventional forces. And Jenny, we have been seeing this increase in joint exercises between South Korea and the United States. And I just wonder what you both think, but I'll go to you first, Jenny. In a sense, are we not sort of throwing some oil, if you wish, on the fire by having these joint exercises, especially when they've been as large as they've been in recent weeks and this year?
I think, the idea that the US and South Korea do joint military exercises is necessary for military readiness. The way they do them does matter, though, to the political situation and to the security situation and to the perception from both North Korea and China about what's actually happening. Back before the summit process, before 2018, we used to have set cycles of joint military exercises, large scale, live fire. They were announced in advance. They were predictable. And there was two different cycles, spring cycle, winter cycle. So there was a way to anticipate what was happening. There was a way to justify this. This is routine. What we've seen since last year, when the US and South Korea resumed their joint military exercises, is sort of this idea of having back-to-back exercises, again, large-scale live fire, some of the biggest exercises that we've seen that have ever been conducted. Some of it has been justified as being part of military readiness, considering that there has not been exercises for the past several years now, since 2018, both due to the diplomatic process first and then due to the pandemic. But some of it has been in response to North Korean actions as well. And so we've sort of gotten caught up in this, this more muscular response to North Korea's provocations, that is basically egging on North Korea to do more muscular responses as well. And so it's a really hard balancing act to find what is responsive to growing South Korean concerns of North Korean activities, trying to balance what actually is responsive to South Korean concerns over rising, North Korean provocations, as well as, how is it actually being perceived by the North Koreans, and is it really intimidating or is it really dissuasive of the actions that they're taking?
Sig, how do you see this?
Well, I think Jenny said it very well. I have mixed emotions on the exercises. On one hand, if North Korea continues to build more and better bombs and is more threatening to everyone around them, including the United States, how can the U.S. respond? So U.S. and South Korea together. And so the joint military exercises are I think they're a legitimate way to come back and say, hey, look, you continue to threaten us. We have to be able to respond. Having said that part that gets me, they ought to hire a different PR manager. For heaven's sakes, when you say we're going to have joint exercises for decapitation, of
Right.
North Korea, I mean, that just then gives North Korea all the excuse to say, hey, look, we have to continue to do that because of the hostile policies of the United States and South Korea.
Let me ask you this. We talk about the joint exercises with United States and South Korea. When North Korea conducts its military exercises, are they working with China?
Now, from everything that I can see, is typically not. They have some connections to China, but I've never seen a strong military connection as it relates to the nuclear situation. You asked before, how in the world did North Korea actually develop these nuclear weapons? And I mentioned they got some assistance, for civilian nuclear technologies from the Russians, but the Russians and Soviets did not help them develop the nuclear program. And the Chinese did not help them to develop the nuclear program. And the Chinese, however, did give them some assistance when it comes to missiles, as did the Russians. But there's no direct sort of military cooperation that I know of between China and North Korea, as there is between the U.S., South Korea, and the UN forces on the peninsula.
So there's been a great deal of speculation this year that North Korea may do another nuclear test, which they've not done since, I believe it's 2017. What's the likelihood of that, and what would be the reaction? Sig, I'll go to you first. What's the likelihood?
I think there's a distinct likelihood. The North Koreans need to do more nuclear tests to go with their rhetoric. And their threatening rhetoric, particularly against the United States and South Korea. And the reason, they've done 6 nuclear tests starting in 2006 and the last one in 2017. 6 on one hand is quite a lot. I mean, that's as many as India and Pakistan have done. It sort of pales in comparison to the United States at 1,054, for example. Now, why in the world did we do 1,054 nuclear tests? Well, we did all kinds of things, nuclear experiments and other things. But, if you're going to have a diverse arsenal, you need to have a lot of nuclear tests. And the North Koreans actually have quite a diverse missile capability, and Jenny pointed that out. Even now, they continue to try new and different types of missiles. Well, you don't just take the same nuclear package and you stick it into a different type of delivery system or missile. And so because the North Koreans have developed so many different types of delivery systems, missiles, cruise missiles, and things of that nature, you need to have nuclear tests to go with that. So they have a serious technical need for nuclear tests.
Let's bring this to closer to home. Can they now reach the United States? And if not, when might they be able to?
So we don't know that for sure. My own thought on that is that they cannot yet reliably reach the United States with a nuclear weapon. They've demonstrated the basic capabilities, and that is they have missiles that have enough horsepower to be able to reach the United States. But when they've tested them in what we call a lofted trajectory. So they keep them close to home. That way they can monitor them. So they loft them up high and keep them close. Well, to reach the United States, you got to flatten them out. And they haven't done one of those missile tests. And then when you do flatten them out and you go out into space, you re-enter, that's when you have enormous pressures, high temperatures, and you need to make sure this delicate nuclear package survives that. They can't possibly yet have convinced themselves that they can do that. So they might be able to launch one and have some luck, of being able to reach and being able to re-enter. But you don't count on luck. And so in my opinion, they have not yet demonstrated the ability to reach the United States with a nuclear weapon.
Can I just add to that? I think Sig is right, is that, the North Koreans, there is a technical need, or they would want to test more nuclear weapons because they have new designs. And we have seen more recently a new nuclear weapons design, a warhead design. And they certainly have been working to restore access to the Punggye-ri nuclear test site to make it test capable again. But if you look at the rhetoric that North Korea has put out in the last few months, they're already talking about mass production of these new nuclear warheads. And even when they showed us the new one, instead of just showing us one like they've done in the past, they showed us that there were already multiple warheads manufactured. And to me, this says that I think it's unlikely that we'll see another nuclear test soon. I think they've decided, for whatever reason, they don't necessarily need to do that. And they've decided to move forward because they're already talking about mass production. What Sig said about the reliability and the accuracy of their ICBM technologies, I think we're much more likely to see more ICBM tests, both at lofted trajectories and starting to do at range trajectories as well. I think we're going to see that much more. I think it's much more likely than we'll see a nuclear test.
Jenny, I hear what you're saying, but let's just for a moment say that they do conduct a nuclear test. What should, in your view, be the United States response?
I think our options are kind of limited, right? Some of it depends on what the UN Security Council is willing to do in response. And so far, what we've seen is the Chinese and Russians blocking any kind of punitive actions, especially anything that is advocating for new sanctions on North Korea, which is the normal response.
The perennial problem with the Security Council.
So a problem with the Security Council, but also then, what you'll see is, again, more doubling down on the other side of the equation, on the bolstering deterrence in South Korea, bolstering cooperation in South Korea. I think you'll see much more robust trilateral security cooperation between the US, South Korea, and Japan as ways to, respond of, if we're going in this direction, if we are having a more insecure security environment, that, and we have limited options to get the North Koreans, to dissuade the North Koreans from actually taking these actions, that we're really just focused on how to better respond to and prepare for defenses.
Let me just chime in for a second. To answer very specifically, what we can do is wring our hands and essentially nothing else. I mean, there just is nothing, for the reasons Jenny said, at the UN Security Council. We're going to take it there for sure, but nothing's going to happen. The only country that can affect North Korea's calculus about nuclear testing, and it's doing so, and in my opinion is probably the reason why they haven't tested, because being a technical guy, let me tell you, if I were there in North Korea, I would go to the whatever, up the chain all the way up to the young leader and say, look, if you want to have the capabilities that you've been advertising, we must do more nuclear tests. That's what I would tell them. I would not be satisfied with what we have. The country that really affects the nuclear testing calculus is China. So, China is not really terribly happy that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but they have them. And to some extent, that sort of comes in handy now, with the China-U.S. Problems and competition. However, what China does not want for sure is for North Korea to do another nuclear test. And that is when they did the last one in 2017. It's not very far from the Chinese border, that is the nuclear test site in North Korea. And the windows shook across the border, and people were scared as can be in China. And the Chinese were really, really upset. And so the Chinese, I'm sure, have told the North Koreans, don't you do another nuclear test. I think that's what's coming into their calculus. Technically, there's a driver for doing the test. Politically, it's China's opposition. That's my point of view. And I've had my Chinese nuclear colleagues have told me that.
What led the South Korean president to hint, I guess that's the right word to use, that South Korea might want to develop its own nuclear weapons, or at least have the United States deploy our weapons and have a stronger umbrella for the country, over the country?
I think Jenny follows the Korean Peninsula news media much closer than I do. I think he did much more than hint. And Jenny knows from the inside as to how the South Korean public feels. And so, Jenny, I'll turn to you.
He did walk back from what he said, but Jenny, take it. And if you can limit your reply for about a minute, that'd be helpful.
Sure. South Korea has actually been debating this issue for the past 10 years or so. It isn't something that came out of nowhere. And there has been rising public support for this as North Korea's capabilities have grown. And especially during the Trump years, when we had a US president that was antagonistic towards alliances in general, and especially South Korea, and threatened to withdraw troops from South Korea. On a couple of occasions, right? But there was a really big turning point last year, and that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This really heightened all the anxieties inside South Korea about how this might affect how China thinks about issues like Taiwan, and how North Korea might think about its options in the future, being a country with nuclear weapons. And so this has really caused a lot more debate and a lot more support for nuclear weapons, both in the public and in policy circles. And so a lot of what President Yoon, for him to say what he said, this is a reflection of what the debate inside South Korea actually is. There's gotten to be a pretty loud voice advocating for South Korea to go nuclear.
And I'm going to have to jump in, Jenny, and ask you to wrap that answer up if you can, because I do want to hear about the Washington Declaration.
Yeah.
How important is it?
And I think it is important to show that the U.S. can be responsive to South Koreans' anxieties, and that it is willing to try and adjust, to give, the bilateral alliance more of a voice, more of an understanding of the nuclear process than we've ever had on a bilateral basis. But it's not going to be enough to stop the debate inside South Korea, because there's just too many factors and too many drivers, including the idea of prestige, right? North Korea has nuclear weapons, so there's a certain degree to which South Korea wants to too. And I think there's also just this emergence of this notion that only nuclear weapons deter nuclear weapons. And so until we can deflate that and get back to how do we reduce nuclear weapons in general, I think we're going to continue to have this problem.
So we have an audience in our studio today, and one of the questions is, given how and what we know about North Korea, what circumstances might cause the regime to launch a nuclear attack? And would they be the first to launch one?
I guess my view of that is I don't really see the circumstance for North Korea. It's a suicide mission they're not suicidal. And so, in most likelihood, it would be some sort of misunderstanding, miscalculation, or perhaps, the one circumstance I could say, there are some in the United States that would like to see regime change and Kim Jong-un out of power. So one potential circumstance, suppose that happens somehow and his military takes over and we know essentially nothing about that military. Could they potentially launch a suicidal attack? And that's possible. And so that would be my greatest worry.
So, negotiations were conducted during the Trump administration. To the best of my knowledge, there really hasn't been a lot of communication since. Why not? Because the United States says we're ready to meet, but nothing's happened.
We've had a fundamental phase change. I mentioned the one in 1990 when Kim Il-sung decided to pursue normalization with the United States. I think around 2022, we had a fundamental change in Kim Jong-un who said, forget the United States, I'm getting back to work with Russia and with China. And we haven't quite realized that yet.
Well, Jenny, how do you see it? 30 seconds.
Yeah, I agree with Sig, and I would just add too that we're in a very different political situation now where there is actually an arms race going on in East Asia. And the idea that North Korea in the middle of that would agree to come to the table and put limits on their own arms while the rest of the region, including South Korea, is arming up, I think is just unrealistic to begin with.
Well, I want to thank you both for a fascinating conversation. Given the growing number of international crises we're presently dealing with, it's no surprise that North Korea may be on the back burner. But should it be? President Obama's warning to President-elect Trump that the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula represented a serious threat is, unfortunately, as true today as it was back in 2016, maybe even more so. The United States, North Korea, and South Korea, in my view, each bears some responsibility for the escalation and failure to reach a satisfactory agreement. However, without denuclearization, North Korea will continue to threaten South Korea, Japan, and yes, as we heard today, even the United States. And while it makes sense for the United States to strengthen and reaffirm our defense alliance with Seoul, I hope that we will continue to seek a diplomatic path. Thank you for watching our program where we continue talking about things that matter with people who care. See you next time.